So hello to everybody. I want to briefly explain why we are having this conversation. So my name is Michel Bauwens. I'm the founder of the P2P Foundation. And Franz Nahrada is the founder of the Global Villages Network. He can explain in detail after. And we're all friends, but also we've been talking about politics and strategy and how to make a better world together. And we're both active in different ways. But this is specifically because I was invited to give a presentation about the integral tradition and the value revolution in the context of the early Marx. And as I could not attend, so we decided to record it. It's not appropriate for the festival, but we'll publish this independently. So Franz, do you want to say anything about yourself before we start? And I'll start with my presentation about the integrative tradition and how it relates to value, and then you can react to it with your own insights. But first, maybe just say a few words, not too long, about who you are, so that people have a basic context of who they are listening to.
Okay. My name is Franz Nahrada. I'm originally a sociologist and also hotel manager from Vienna, Austria. And I had, as a student, heavy involvement in also politics and critique of science and humanities, and which led me to kind of odyssey through different steps of recognition, how we have to deepen Marxism so it really can help us not only understand the world better, but also develop a strategy in today's complex environment. And my center point, and that makes me very compatible with Michel, is a kind of cosmolocalism, which means that I call it global villages in plural, which means that the translocal connections, the global connections, actually can strengthen our localities. Indeed, I once was blessed with a letter from Corinne McLuhan. She said, "You understood it right. You know, my husband always said, when you have an expansion in global connections, it will reverse into an unprecedented renaissance of the local." So that is exactly what I'm working for. And I think Michel and I are really working on the same thing.
Right. I want to add that none of us is formally Marxist anymore. But we respect the tradition. So not in any partisan way, just, like you have Christianity, which has good and bad, and Marxism, Freudism. So we take some of the insights of the tradition seriously. And so we are in this context, because of the invitation of Cadel Last, we are in dialogue with it. But I'm not going to stress it too much. I'm going to start. So the official title of the invitation was "The Rebirth of the Integral Left." So what does it mean, integral, integrative? So that's basically what I want to start explaining. So I will draw first of all on a radical thinker called Lauren Goldner, and I have a whole section in my wiki prompted by his thinking, and I call it the category cosmobiological. And so the basic argument is the following: is that you have in the world people who see the world as a binary between the material world and the spiritual world, mind and matter, if you like. And, Descartes would be a really good example of that, splitting the world in these two realms. And that became like the dominant way of looking at reality, certainly in the West. But there's another way, which is to see the world in a kind of unified, integrated, non-dual form, where matter and spirit are, part of the same world. We don't distinguish them in like really separate realms. They are interdependent and co-arising and co-determining each other. So Lauren Goldner has a particular interpretation of the role of Marxism in that general idea. He says, until the Renaissance, that non-dual tradition was very strong in Europe, and the thinkers of the Renaissance held them in balance. They were both scientists and humanists, and were interested in spirituality, and they didn't see any contradiction. Think about Paracelsus and his work about medicine. It has elements of physical science, but also of astrology and all kinds of things. And they saw this as a unified worldview, which was very strong related to what's called the Hermetic tradition. But then something happened with the Enlightenment, which is that world was split. So now we have mind and matter, and nature becomes like this dead object that can be analyzed scientifically, but is separated from us. And the human is separated from nature. And mind and matter is two entirely different things. And he says that inaugurates the cold tradition, of which official Marxism was a representation of. And so basically the scientists and the engineers, which continue with the Enlightenment tradition, but have hegemonic roles within the left parties, basically set in motion this cold tradition of separation. But there's another line, which is quite important, and that is actually that the Renaissance line continued to exist in a more hidden Hermetic tradition, which ended with Jacob Boehme. I mean, it didn't end, but it culminated with Jacob Boehme, a German spiritual thinker, which was a main influence on Hegel. And so the German idealism tradition continued in Goldner's view. That warm tradition, of course, the young Marx, which is the topic of Cadell's seminar, the early Marx, was entirely part of that world. He recognized that unity and that kind of warmth tradition. And so the integral tradition basically wants to keep that warmth alive. So not splitting the human from nature, from matter, but consider us as a kind of interdependent emanation from this one reality. And I'm very interested in this. So, if you're interested in integrative thinking, for example, I'm studying macro history, and in macro history, you have the cultural historians with Spengler and Toynbee and Quigley and Sorokin. You have spiritual tradition with Teilhard de Chardin, Aurobindo, and I would consider them expressions of this warm integrative tradition. So they've always been people who want to have the objective and the subjective in one reality. And a modern exponent of this, which I had a big part of, was Ken Wilber. And I think he studied biology, but he published a book that was really, in our view, people like me who are really enthusiastic about it, was a very important book, which is called The Spectrum of Consciousness. And so here's what he did. He basically, first of all, made a synthesis of Western psychological thinking. And, if you're an unhappy and troubled young man like I was in that time, you wonder what should you be doing about it, right? What therapy, what path is the right one? And of course, there's Freud, and there's Jung, and there's human potential movement, and there's Gestalt therapy. Like, where do you even go? And what Wilber did was put all these paths on a spectrum of development. And so depending on where you are in your psychological development, one or the other of these tools and approaches might be the right one for you. And that, in my view, was an illumination that all these things could be true at a certain level. From a certain perspective, they were valuable, but not from all perspectives. And depending on the perspective, you could have a evaluation of them. Then he did the same for the East. And he looked at all the transmental development schemes, because there's a difference between the West and the East. In the West, if we say meditation, we mean meditation on a text, going deep and thinking deep. Of course, in the East, it's looking at your mind, right? So it's transmental, and that leads to a whole other kind of potential development. Samadhi, satori, all these notions from the East, from Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. And he mapped those out. And so that's what the spectrum of consciousness is, like a full account, integrating all these relative truths from these different traditions in one interpretive scheme. And then he came up with something that also was important for me, and I still kind of use it as a heuristic device, so how to know things. So he said every phenomena has a subjective and an objective aspect, an interior and an exterior aspect. And they're both true, they're both important. And they express themselves individually and collectively. So you have 4 quadrants. So this is called equal, all quadrants, all lines, I believe. That's the technical meaning. So we have interior subjective, the I, the evolution of the I. You have the it, the exterior objective, the evolution of objects, for example, the evolution of technological artifacts. You have organizational systems which organize the its, like HR, the human management system or the economic system. And then you have collective cultures, which of course also determine individual psychology, which is Buddhist culture, Christian culture, Western culture, etc. And so the invitation is that when you look at something, you basically make this sweep, and you don't necessarily believe that one or the other aspect is fully determinative of the other. So when I read, for example, macrohistory, I can read the historical idealists who believe in human agency and the power of ideas, and I get the insights from this. But then I can read the historical materialists, basically, Marxists, post-Marxists, who look at geopolitics and productive systems, Immanuel Wallerstein, Brodel, and I can also get insights from them. But the chicken and the egg question is basically not that important in that context, because you have a unified reality where mind and matter are, co-arising and co-determining each other, and they're feedback loops in all different directions. So that's what the integrative tradition is, and then just to make it real, maybe for people. So the way I look at this in a maybe simplistic way is, so your perspective, your consciousness, when you look at something, it sheds light on a particular object or process, and that creates a shadow. Other perspectives will similarly create light and illuminate the object, but create different kinds of shadow. And so by combining perspectives, by integrating perspectives, you can get a more complex and real view of the truth. So that's basically what's behind the integral tradition. And now I want to say a word about the integral left. So Ken Wilber is not recognized really by academia, but he's really, really influential. So you'll find his books, it's like Osho's books, you'll find them everywhere in the world, in any second-hand or first-hand bookshop, wherever you go. Like in Thailand, you'll find Ken Wilber everywhere, and you'll find, you find Osho everywhere, for example, right? So these are authors that are of interest long after they died, and their books keep reappearing. And so there is a kind of non-academic influence, amongst architects and all kinds of people that are inspired by Wilberism to this day. It's if you think about John Vervaeke, he will have read Wilber and reacted to Wilber, or Brendan Graham Dempsey, if you know any of these names. Pascal Lehmann, all these people have had a schooling in the integral theory of Ken Wilber and are reacting to it and are furthering it in their own lives. Even, if they're not canonical about it, but it's a huge influence. And so what happened with Wilber is he wrote all these books. Then he had a kind of a crisis because his wife had cancer and he kind of retreated for a while. Then he came back and he was supported by a rich person called Joe Firmage, who was the head of a company called US Web CKS. I happened to work for that company when was that? In the late 90s. And so his work got funded and that became the Integral Institute. And within that Integral Institute, there was a small group of people who had a more like leftist point of view. And I was one of them. So just to say that the integral tradition of Ken Wilber, is not like a labor tradition or a Marxist tradition at all. It's kind of more like a middle class, California ideology type of milieu. Doesn't mean it's not important, but it's not intrinsically linked to the emancipatory tradition that came out of Marx and the labor movement. And so there's a person called Michael Brooks who wanted to create a progressive interpretation of the integral tradition. I was briefly part of that. Greg Wilpert, who moved to Venezuela, was part of it. I'm currently talking with Eric Haynes, who was part of it. So it was a small group of people. I don't want to exaggerate, but it didn't go anywhere because the bulk of the integral movement, a la Wilber, went into another direction, more conservative point of view. And in the end, so we kind of left the integral movement. And I just want to say that the P2P Foundation was, in my mind, and I didn't communicate this very broadly because I didn't think it would help because that tradition was really unknown in Europe. It was specifically an attempt to create an integral left by this pragmatic approach of seed forms, and I won't really explain it today, but what is known as the approach of the P2P Foundation, which is based on analyzing and reinforcing seed forms that represent social change. I just want to say a word about the left and the right. So you could see it in a very narrow way as an expression of the industrial society, where the labor movement created like a socialist wing, which was gradually considered to be left. And so the people who wanted to change industrial society and capitalism became, known as the left, and the people who wanted to promote the capitalist forms of society and preserve the existing order were termed to be the right. This is already a simplification. Actually, the early socialists didn't even call themselves left. The original left, modern left, was actually the left wing of the bourgeois revolution and determined by the seating in the French Revolutionary Assembly. This was not labor yet. And originally, labor actually did not call itself left. But so just to show that the meaning of left and right evolves over time. And I started thinking about the more long-term vision of left and right when I read The Evolution of Civilization by Carroll Quigley, which is a really good book about the history of how civilization evolved. And he says, the debates between the Catholics and the Gnostics, for him, he interprets it as the left and right of that era. So I would say, this is my understanding, that people on the right defend their community. And they want their community to thrive and grow. And they don't necessarily have an automatic sympathy for what is outside of their community. I think, for me, this is like the right-wing basic feeling. And the left-wing feeling is just the opposite. We want to extend that unity to the broader aspects, so all humans or other humans or humans and life, etc., etc. And I think this tension will always exist. It's almost biological. It's kind of like a very deep psychological structure that we have, and we can change. We can be very left-wing when we're young and then evolve to a more conservative position when we get older. And so when I talk about the integral left, I'm not saying this is simply like a replay of the old left, the old Marxist, socialist, or even liberal left. This is the tension that will emerge from living in a cognitive AI-mediated society. And it will, but it remains like, do we extend our circle of care or not? It remains a debate, whatever type of society we will have. All right, so this brings me then to the last part of my introduction, which is about the value revolution. And so I would claim every revolution is a value revolution. Example I like to give is the Romans, antiquity, the Greeks. They see labor as a very low form of value because it's done by slaves. And the ideal of a citizen is not to work and to devote his life to his city and philosophy. So that's, work is not good. And there's even a bad word in ancient Greek. And if you would tell that to the citizen, they would feel insulted. So if you would tell them that you're a worker, that would be a really, really bad thing. And the Christians clearly changed that. Ora et labora, pray and work. So you can see there also the idea of the resurrection of the body, that matter and spirit are put on a more much integrated vision. Because we owe everything to the divine, we need to work well, and work is also an expression of the divine. We collaborate in creating more order in the world following the divine teachings. And so the Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, are sociological religions that kind of insist on this being in the world and improving the world as a really important part. So you can see the difference. That was a value revolution. No more slaves, but serfs, people living in communities, in parishes, believers that are also persons, and the monks making beautiful places. So labor is salvific. So clearly that's a value revolution. And then in the 17th century, we have a big debate about what is value. The feudal tradition placed it in land. Value comes from the land, the physiocrats. But then the new thinkers, Ricardo, Adam Smith, and then Marx, they say, no, it comes from labor as a commodity. So capitalism, places value, its origin in the commodity. So we have to extract something that makes it rare and scarce, and that creates a tension between supply and demand. And so I'm shifting now to what the peer-to-peer and the commons movement and what I bring to the table in this is that we believe we have a new value revolution at hand, which is a shift to contributory value. And it's all about thermodynamics. So since the Neolithic and the invention of money, we have based our economies on the principle of extraction, either conquest, as in traditional societies, or capitalist expansion. Extraction comes first. Extraction creates value. Then we monetize and represent it, and then we tax it and eventually redistribute it and use it for regenerative ecological purposes. That means that structurally, extraction is always bigger than regeneration, because regeneration depends on the extraction. There's no value if we don't extract first. And of course, labor is also extracted commodity value. And so I think the value revolution means that it now has to be linked to thermodynamic health of the planet. So extraction stays. We need to eat, we need to shelter, we need many things, but we have to do it in such a way that the planet can continue to exist in a healthy way for thousands and millions of years. And I'll give you an example of what that could be. So there's many ways that contributory value is already, being emerging, and so this is the tier of seed forms. Like, for example, in many peer production communities, free software communities, they'll have some form to recognize the contributions that are not recognized by the market, and they'll have like a double accounting system and some ways to compensate the people who contribute outside of the market. So that's already contributory value. But more profoundly, I think that money creation in the end, insofar as money will continue to exist for a while, and I believe that that will be the case, is that it has to be linked to the thermodynamic health. And so there are various systems being proposed and tried out where the monetary creation is dependent on the health of the ecosystem. So, and we can measure this. Can the soil improve? Is the air improving? Is the water level improving? And that makes the monetary creation dependent on regeneration, not extraction. So in this scenario, we have flipped the value around, where extraction now becomes dependent on regeneration. Okay, I think I'll stop here. This is just to give a very general picture. I think I've talked half an hour, which is okay. And so I will give the floor to my friend Franz Nahrada. Maybe I should say that he worked with the Crisis Group, which is a Marxist group in Germany that had probably the most advanced work on what value is within capitalism, but also how it's changing and being actually abolished. Franz, I would say if you can, talk 20 minutes, and then maybe we can have another 10 minutes to exchange and keep within the hour. Thank you. Thank you for this. I can't hear you, Franz. The sound is not on.
Right. Okay. Out of technical reasons, so we might avoid some kind of disturbance. When I was asked by Michel for this contribution to the Portalooza festival on the young Marx, I said, okay, let's deepen. Let's go back to the. We arrive at the same conclusions, by the way. That's obvious. But let's go back and zoom in and have a closer look, because there are many people still in this mental framework of Marxism, which has its benefits and its limits. And I think that reconsidering the very nature of value in a capitalist society is a very essential point. And I should start with also theoretical impulses. So I would really give a lot of credit to my first teacher, who was Michael Roth, Volkbert Michael Roth from Constance. And he was giving, in 1974, he was invited to a seminar we had with about 30 people on the theory of cognition. And that was really interesting, because he said, you can only explain how you understand reality at a real example. Yeah. So let's take Marx Capital as a possible model for understanding an object. And that was really interesting, how he managed to make us understand the complexity of Marx thought and the necessity to start with abstractions and to gradually bring all elements of reality into the right perspective. Because it's a lot of perspectives. But the main thesis of Mike Roth, how he used to be called, was that the best way to analyze capitalism is to analyze it as a system of forms of value. You know, everybody who reads The Capital has read this enigma's first chapter about the form of equivalent and the relative form, value form, and so on. And then they throw it away. And they say, okay, well, this is esoteric nonsense. And then we come to real things like exchange and money and labor and all these things. But that is utterly wrong. I mean, understanding the very nature of value is the only way to understand what is money and what is capital. So that was already my theoretical start, if you wish, in 1974. And then I went through various stages. And one of the stages, after being very active in academic criticism, was to be in closer contact with a group which did not call itself value form analysis, but value critique. That was this German group originating as Marxist critique and then renamed their journal into Crisis. And I think this point I would really like to put a close explanation. And because the subject of this conference was the Young Marx, or is the Young Marx, that's going on the 5th, 6th of August, I would like to start with a very little known passage of Young Marx, namely the James Mill excerpts. This is not even in MAV, it is just in the Mega. It is something which does not...
So those are like collected works of Marx, just for people who don't know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. These are the two German editions. So the Mega is the big one that has everything in it, Gesamtausgabe, and there you find it. So why do I stress on this even more than the Paris manuscripts and all these more famous things of Young Marx? Because there, in the confrontation with James Mill as an apologetic economist of capitalism, he stresses one point, that there is no such thing as harmonious exchange. So in this excerpts, Marx uses a lot of very drastic expressions about what we normally see as exchange process. It's not, as he describes it, a process of harmonious mutual benefit, rather a form of reciprocal appropriation. And he says, if I could plunder you directly, I would take from you, but I can't. So I have to use these economic means. But he really uses the word, the economy as it is, capitalism, is a system of mutual plundering. So that means that behind the apparent equality of exchanges lies a relation in which each party seeks to extract as much as possible from the other by economic means. Giving as little money as possible at the market or getting as much quality. You know all this phenomenon.
Of course.
Value then, from the very beginning, appears not as a harmonious, but essentially extractive social relation. Value is the attempt to produce something which represents a big chunk of societal recognized labor. Okay. And this is a point where Robert Kurz, he went so much deeper and he really destroyed a myth of traditional Marxism, and I like that very much. He said, many people in Marxist circles, they read the first pages of a Capital, you know, the enormous collection of commodities, and the commodities, they have use value, but they also have something bad like exchange value. No? So, and many people read it as, there is a good use value where things are useful, yeah, and there is a bad layer of exchange. Things are kept only to sell them, yeah. So the problem is use values under capitalism are themselves produced within the logic of value accumulation. The issue is not merely that exchange distorts otherwise innocent production, but rather the production of wealth itself is from the very beginning subordinated to the endless expansion of abstract value. And therefore, Robert Kurz says, even use value, yeah, the good, nice use value, usefulness of the thing is already an abstraction. It presents the commodity merely as something useful for an isolated individual, the so-called customer, while suppressing the dense web of ecological, social, and historical relations from which every object emerges. The forest, the soil, the rivers, the knowledge accumulated over generations, the embeddedness in commons, forms of cooperation, the unpaid care work, the metabolic exchange with nature, all this is just wiped out. It disappears behind the seemingly innocent question, what is the quality that makes this object good for me? So in its very core, the commodity is not a single abstraction, it is a double abstraction. As exchange value, it reduces the richness of the world to quantities of abstract labor. Yes, we know that. But as use value, it reduces the richness of the world to abstract utility for an isolated consumer. So in both cases, the living relationships that constitute real wealth, they disappear from the view. A regenerative economy or a contributional economy, whatever you call it, therefore cannot simply produce different commodities. As Michel said, the nature, if you wish, the extractive nature is built into the economic form. It must begin with a different concept of wealth. Wealth is not the accumulation of objects or value, the power to attract objects with money or any other thing that like capital. It's all forms of value, higher forms of value. But the real wealth is the flourishing of relationships between people, between communities, and between humanities and the living earth. The value of a forest is not exhausted by its timber, nor the value of knowledge by its market price, nor the value of care by its wage. Their essential contribution lies in their capacity to sustain and regenerate the conditions of life itself. So this is why I think this distinction we heard between extractive and contributive or regenerative value that reaches beyond economics. It points towards a civilizational shift from valuing what can be extracted to valuing what enables life to reproduce and flourish. Only from that perspective can we begin to imagine a post-capitalist, if you wish, theory of value. Capitalism measures value by what can be extracted. A regenerative society would recognize value by what can be regenerated. This might, of course, also point towards the rebirth of an integral left. For more than 2 centuries, much of the left has shared with liberal modernity the same underlying ontology. Nature as external object, society as the privileged realm of history, and production as humans defining activity. We are now at the end of this world, you know. We have now AI and robotics, and suddenly, what is the place of humans in this world, you know? The struggle was over who should own and distribute the products of labor or the means of production. but not over the deeper questions of how life itself is reproduced. A regenerative perspective changes the focus entirely. It recognizes that human labor is only one moment within much larger processes of regeneration: ecological, social, cultural, and cognitive. They all play together. Wealth is not created by labor alone in this new framework, of course. Yeah? It emerges from living systems that continually reproduce the conditions under which labor, knowledge, and society can exist at all. So this, dear friends, in my view, maybe I'm slightly different from Michel here. For me, this does not abandon Marx, because Marx opened the door to the recognition of the what he calls the central element, or the elementary form, yeah? the Elementarform des gesellschaftlichen Reichtums. The elementary form of the social wealth is the commodity. Therefore, our analysis starts with a commodity. No, it does not abandon Marx, it radicalizes him.
Mm.
It extends the critique of exploitation to the critique of extraction itself. Not only the extraction of surplus labor, but of soil fertility, biodiversity, care, knowledge, community, and ultimately, as we all can see, the Earth's regenerative capacities. An integral left would therefore no longer define emancipation simply as the liberation of labor, but as liberations of life's capacity to regenerate itself. If we have time, I would also like about the special nature of labor, or if we find a new word, because even Robert Kurz was easily driven to the idea condemning labor as an integral part of capitalist society. And I think labor does not deserve this devaluation.
Right.
Anyway, the young Marx, one last.
So when you finish, I want to say something about labor, and then 5 minutes, and you can react 5 minutes. Yeah. Well, we'll focus on labor in the last 10 minutes.
Okay, last concluding sentence. The young Marx envisioned communism as the restoration of humanity's conscious relationship with its own social nature, beyond the fetishism of the ware, of the commodity. Today, in the age of ecological breakdown, this vision must be expanded once more towards the conscious regeneration of the web of life of which humanity is a part. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. Yeah, I want to say something about labor as well. So basically, for me, contribution is what replaces labor. So I've read a book which actually it's a PhD thesis which I really like. It has this weird title, From Modes of Production to the Resurrection of the Body, by Ben Suriano. And he stresses basically the notion of salvific labor that was introduced by Christianity. So the Christian monks, they produce. It's a communism of production, not just of consumption like the Buddhists, right? They collectivize their living together, and they're dedicated to make something beautiful and to make their own food and make it in a beautiful way, etc., etc. So the labor becomes an expression of the sacredness of the integration of the spirit and the world of matter. And okay, I might simplify, but then he says that the Reformation, by making wealth a sign of grace and by agreeing to the commodification of labor, actually degrades labor. And then Marx, resacralizes in a way labor by making it the vehicle of emancipation and liberation. And so this is what I think is no longer working. So I think in a certain sense, yes, labor is part of capital. It's, either it wants to take over and effectively manage the industrial system, which is what actually existing socialism tried to do, or it just negotiates for a bigger pie. And so I think this is still going on. I see you disagree, but I think this is still going on. But I think at the same time, this new mode of production is already emerging within capital, which is based on new premises, which is that of contribution and the commons. And so I see all the people who contribute to the commons, the commoners, as the people who are, doing salvific labor for the earth. And I see this kind of trinity of the living world, humanity, and AI as a kind of arrangement for the future where basically, so we need to do three things. We need to extend the social contract to the whole world, right? So basic health, basic lodging, this is something that every human being should have, not just in the West, but everywhere. So this is the social contract between humans. But we need to extend that social contract to the living world. Like we need to recognize our interdependence. And so we actually need a partnership with the natural beings and the resources that we are using in our extractive capacity. And then I see AI as a mediating technology, which makes that complexity, visible and manageable. So just as a kind of mediating tool, nothing more. And anyway, so that's kind of, I don't have the time to go in details, but this is, so I don't think labor disappears, but I just don't believe in the scenario of, labor within a capitalist society taking over the means of production for many different reasons.
Okay.
But okay, you intervene, and then we'll see.
Okay. I talked with you about various stages in my post-Marxist, if you wish, development, and one of the latest stages was also in Erlangen. I met a very interesting writer who was very critical of this idea that we should throw away the concept of labor. And he already much earlier, I had a friend who wrote a thesis, which I totally can put my name under also. I would totally agree. The idea is Marx gives this example in the 5th chapter of Capital about the bee and the constructor, which means the bee can build a fantastic beehive, but the beehive did not exist in the brain of the bee before it was produced, before it was made. And that is the very, very difference between the concept of, how should I say, a complex natural process and the unique human capacity of planning and anticipating. Because actually, the core of labor is not manual work. The core of labor, that is why Marx also sometimes talks about produktiver Gesamtarbeiter, the productive total laborer. The core of labor is this anticipatory.
I completely agree, by the way. I just want to say that I talk about orchestration, as a word for that, but go ahead.
Okay, so and this guy in Erlangen, he gave a beautiful definition of labor. Labor is the one human activity that constantly diminishes its own necessity. Yeah, and Marx at the beginning of the 13th chapter says no machine ever was produced to save human labor, but the very core of human labor is to invent processes and better forms of tools and things like that to diminish the toiling, the how should I say, the pain of manual labor. And it gives more and more space for creative development of capacities. What you lose on one side in the manual labor, you have to build on the other side, and the intellectual, how should I say, superstructure of labor. And this very superstructure of labor is, and that is really, really something that almost nobody talks about, is constantly destroyed by industrial society. It wants to keep us away from the knowledge that we need to produce things ourselves. Mm. And that, therefore, I admire people like Friedrich Bergmann, who at the very end said, we have to reorganize the capacity of labor separated from capital. And that is, for me, a very interesting emancipatory perspective by itself.
Yeah, in our preparatory conversation, Franz, you said a phrase that I really like, is that we are evolving towards a world where capital doesn't need labor and labor doesn't need capital. And I think this is brilliant. And I can follow you in that. And so I have another intellectual hero, which is Bernard Stiegler, who wrote a foreword to my book some years ago, and he also died. And he's a philosopher of technology, which I consider to be the closest to my thinking, peer-to-peer, commons-oriented thinking. And he says basically agrees with what we're saying here. So the two things that he was focused on was on negentropy, right? The against entropy, that this is a key task of humanity, is to manage and counter entropy, which is the result of our own actions. So the dissolution of order and the degradation of the environment. But he also says that the form that capitalism takes, especially now, is the proletarization of knowledge. So not in creating a class like in the 19th century that, of course, also already lost its craft knowledge and was replaced by machines that embedded that knowledge. But now everything else, the cognitive work. And so we basically are moving towards a world where the humans know nothing and don't need to know anything. And then the AI is controlled by capital and knows everything. And this is what we're fighting against. So we need to deproletarianize labor again. And you know that, so I'm working with these young technological people, and they're building these infrastructures, and that's their aim, is to take control of their own production and their own knowledge, and moving away from the technology that is controlled by capital.
Okay, that's a very good final word.
Yeah. All right, so we have 4 minutes left. I think it's good to stop here, unless you have a final. No, okay, we're good. So maybe we should do this again. But anyway, so this is the first time we do it. So we're gonna upload this video and publish it maybe on the P2P Foundation channel, which has not been used for 10-15 years, or on another channel that maybe Franz has. So we'll see, and I would like to publish it, Franz, before Portalooza, and help also Portalooza at the same time, get maybe more viewers, because we can spread the word.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and you hear more from us, I suppose.